Don't touch the silverware, Maid. Some things in this room are worth more than your whole family. The sentence landed sharper than the click of the closing boardroom doors. A few people laughed because they always laughed when Richard Whitmore wanted them to. Others lowered their eyes into tablets and folders, pretending not to hear what everyone had heard. Naomi Brooks stood beside the polished walnut service cart with a silver coffee pot warming her hand through the cloth napkin wrapped around the handle. She did not answer. She did not even blink. She simply placed another porcelain cup beside a man in a navy suit and moved to the next seat, as if cruelty were just another item on the morning agenda. 42 floors above Manhattan, the Whitmore Tower boardroom glittered with money. Sunlight poured through walls of glass and spread across marble floors so clean they reflected shoes worth more than most monthly rents. The long conference table gleamed like still water. Leather chairs lined both sides, filled with men and women whose watches flashed every time they turned a page. At the far end sat Richard Whitmore, 60 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a charcoal suit cut so precisely it looked sculpted onto him. He wore confidence the way other people wore coats. Today, he was selling part of the company his family had built over 3 generations, and no one in the room doubted that the meeting would end exactly how he wanted. No one except the woman pouring coffee. Naomi moved quietly, but nothing about her mind was quiet. 29 years old, 5'7", dark eyes steady, posture straight. She had learned long ago that silence often let people reveal everything. Her black housekeeping uniform was pressed smooth, collar neat, name badge polished. To the room, she was background. To Naomi, the room was a theater of habits she knew by heart. The impatient tapping of a gold pen meant a director wanted numbers changed. The sudden smile from legal counsel meant a risk had been hidden behind language. The way Richard Whitmore leaned back when he insulted someone meant he expected applause. He got it again now. You know what I admire about service workers? Richard said, folding his hands behind his head. They understand their place. More laughter, thinner this time. Naomi reached for the cream pitcher. Her fingers remained steady, though heat rose behind her ribs. She had heard versions of that sentence her whole life. In grocery stores, in school hallways, in apartment lobbies where residents spoke over her mother as if she were furniture. But this room was different because every inch of it held memories. Her mother, Grace Brooks, had polished these same windows for 28 years. She had scrubbed coffee rings from this same table after midnight meetings. She had once told Naomi, while wringing out a mop in a service closet, that rich people left fingerprints everywhere and called it legacy. Naomi had smiled then. She did not smile now. At the center of the table, a law firm partner adjusted his glasses and opened the final contract. As discussed, transfer of controlling interest through Holloway Trust will proceed immediately upon signature. Naomi froze so slightly that no one noticed. The silver spoon in her tray trembled once, then went still. Holloway Trust. The name moved through her like cold wind under a door. She had not heard it in years, not since a hospital room smelling of antiseptic and lilies, where her mother's voice had thinned to a whisper. If they ever try to sell Whitmore, remember that name. Holloway. Don't forget it. Naomi had asked what it meant, but Grace only squeezed her hand and said, some truths stay locked until they're needed. Richard signed smaller papers while assistants aligned folders in front of him. Let's finish this, he said. I have a lunch at 1 and a jet at 3. Pens clicked. Chairs shifted. The room leaned toward the moment money would move. Naomi's pulse beat once, hard enough to hear in her ears. She looked at the contract page from where she stood. Holloway Trust again. Transfer of controlling interests. Controlling interests. A memory surfaced with painful clarity. Her mother pressing a tiny brass key into Naomi's palm years ago, then closing her fingers around it. Keep this hidden. One day they may need someone they never noticed. Naomi had worn that key on a chain beneath her uniform ever since. Richard uncapped an expensive pen and smirked at the room. Amazing, isn't it? Generations build empires. One signature improves them. His hand lowered toward the paper. Naomi set the coffee pot down. Porcelain touched silver with a sound so small it somehow cut through the room. She stepped forward from the wall where invisible people were expected to remain. Mr. Whitmore, she said calmly. Every head turned. You can't sell what was never fully yours. The boardroom went silent in a way silence almost never happens, Complete, sharp, breathing. Richard looked up slowly, amusement first, then irritation. Excuse me. Naomi met his eyes without raising her voice. Holloway Trust doesn't belong to you. A few executives stared at her as if the furniture had spoken. Richard leaned back and smiled the smile people used before trying to humiliate someone publicly. And how? He asked. Would a maid know anything about ownership? Naomi reached beneath the collar of her uniform and touched the hidden chain resting against her skin. Because, she said, your mother made sure someone would. No one moved. The city beyond the glass walls kept shining. Taxis kept threading through traffic 42 floors below. Sunlight kept sliding across steel and stone, but inside the Whitmore boardroom time seemed to pause around a woman in a housekeeping uniform and a sentence no one expected to hear. Richard Whitmore rested the tip of his pen on the contract and studied Naomi Brooks the way people study an inconvenience they assume will disappear on its own. My mother, he said at last, voice smooth and measured, passed away 6 years ago. So whatever story you think you are telling, make it short. A few nervous smiles circled the table. Naomi did not look at them. She looked only at the framed portrait hanging near the side wall. Eleanor Whitmore in pearl earrings and a navy suit. Eyes sharp, chin lifted, painted by someone who understood power but not kindness. Naomi knew another version of that woman. The one who brought sandwiches to night staff during snowstorms. The one who remembered birthdays. The one who once knelt in a service hallway to help Grace Brooks gather spilled mop buckets while executives stepped around them. Your mother knew some things should never be sold, Naomi said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. Security. No one came. 2 guards stood outside the glass doors, uncertain whether to enter a room where billion-dollar signatures and family names were colliding. The law partner cleared his throat. Perhaps we should hear what she believes she knows. Richard turned slowly toward him. You are my counsel, not my philosopher. But the partner had already removed his glasses, polishing them to buy time. The room had changed. Doubt, once absent, now sat in every chair. Naomi reached beneath her collar and drew out a thin silver chain. Hanging from it was a brass key no longer than 2 inches, worn smooth at the edges by years against skin. Several people leaned forward without realizing it. Richard's expression barely shifted, but his fingers left the contract. That key, Naomi said, was given to my mother by Eleanor Whitmore on the last Friday she ever came into this building. The memory returned with painful clarity. Naomi at 23, standing beside a hospital bed while rain tapped against dark windows. Grace Brooks, voice weak but steady, pressing the key into her daughter's hand. If the day ever comes when they forget who built this place, open the drawer no one remembers. Naomi had asked where. Grace smiled faintly. He will know. Enough, Richard said. This is sentimental theater. Naomi turned to him for the first time since speaking. Then tell them what is in your mother's private office. The board members glanced toward the frosted doors at the far end of the corridor. Eleanor's office had remained sealed after her death. Richard had called it respect for mourning. Others had called it discretion. No one had entered since. Richard gave a small laugh that carried no warmth. An empty room. No, Naomi said. A locked walnut desk. Bottom left drawer. Brass keyhole. Silence spread again, deeper now. The chief financial officer shifted in his chair. Richard, she said carefully, is there a reason we have never inventoried the office? Because I do not inventory my mother, he snapped. The answer was too fast, too sharp. Naomi saw several faces change. She knew that look. People who had followed power were beginning to smell fear. Richard rose from his chair, tall and controlled, palms flat on the table. You have embarrassed yourself enough. Return to whatever floor you came from. Naomi remained still. My mother came from every floor in this building, she said. She cleaned them all. She heard everything. She was invisible to men who believed only titles mattered. The words did not sound angry. They sounded true, which was worse. Richard stared at her, and for one brief second something old flickered behind his polished confidence. Recognition. He remembered Grace Brooks. Everyone in the tower remembered Grace once they were forced to. The woman who knew where files vanished, where leaks started, which elevators stuck in winter, which executives drank too much before noon. The woman Eleanor Whitmore trusted enough to speak freely around. Richard looked away first. The law partner slowly closed the contract binder. I recommend a temporary pause before execution. Denied, Richard said. You do not deny counsel, replied the partner, surprising even himself. Naomi watched the shift like weather moving across water. She had not come here to destroy anyone. She had come because her mother's final request had grown louder every year she ignored it. The chief financial officer stood. We can settle this in 10 minutes. Open the office. Open the drawer. If nothing is there, we proceed. Heads nodded around the table. Richard remained standing, but now he seemed alone at the far end of a table that had always belonged to him. Outside, clouds passed over the sun, dimming the room for a breath before light returned. Naomi felt the key warm in her palm. Richard noticed it. Do you know what happens when staff mistake proximity for importance? He asked quietly. Naomi answered just as softly. Do you know what happens when heirs mistake inheritance for ownership? No one laughed this time. The chief financial officer walked toward the glass doors. I am calling. Facilities, she said. No need, Naomi replied. I returned to her. She lifted the brass key slightly. This one opens more than a drawer. The hallway outside the boardroom felt colder than it had 5 minutes earlier. Executives who normally moved with polished certainty now stood in uncertain clusters, whispering into phones they had forgotten to mute. Naomi Brooks walked ahead of them with the brass key resting in her closed palm. Behind her came the chief financial officer, 2 board members, the law partner, and finally Richard Whitmore, whose footsteps were measured but heavier than before. No one offered to carry the key. No one asked Naomi to step aside. The private office waited at the end of the corridor beneath a framed skylight, where pale afternoon light spilled across the carpet. The frosted glass door still read Eleanor Whitmore in gold lettering untouched by time. Naomi had passed that door hundreds of times while pushing carts, changing waste bins, polishing brass handles. She had never entered. Richard stopped beside her. This has gone far enough, he said quietly, careful now that ears were near. Name your price and leave. Naomi turned her head slowly. My mother taught me many things, Mr. Whitmore. Selling silence was not one of them. The chief financial officer inhaled sharply. Richard's face hardened for a moment, then smoothed again into practiced calm. Open it, she said. Richard did not move. Naomi slid the key into the old lock beneath the handle. Metal met metal with a dry click that sounded louder than it should have. The door opened inward on hinges that had not turned in years. Dustless air drifted out carrying faint cedar, old paper, and the soft ghost of lavender. Someone behind Naomi whispered. They kept it cleaned. Naomi knew who had kept it cleaned. Her mother had. Grace Brooks had come every Thursday after hours with a feather cloth and silent loyalty, tending a room no one entered because Eleanor once asked her to. The office was elegant without trying to impress. Dark shelves lined the walls. Family photographs sat in silver frames. A globe stood near the windows overlooking the river. On one wall hung an oil painting of the first Whitmore warehouse, built when the company still moved freight instead of markets. At the center sat a walnut desk broad and heavy, its surface clear except for a fountain pen, a crystal paperweight, and a leather blotter placed perfectly straight. It looked less like abandonment than expectation. Naomi approached slowly. Richard remained near the door. There is nothing here, he said. A memorial space, nothing more. Naomi knelt beside the desk and touched the lower left drawer. Brass keyhole. Exactly where Grace said it would be. She inserted the small key. It turned smoothly. Several people leaned in. The drawer slid open with a soft wooden sigh. Inside lay a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed with dark green wax pressed with the Whitmore crest. Under it sat a leather ledger and a narrow steel box. Naomi did not touch anything at first. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Her mother had carried this truth alone for years while changing linens and emptying trash cans for people who never learned her name. The law partner stepped closer. May I? Naomi nodded and handed him the envelope. He examined the seal, then looked to Richard. Do you object? Richard's silence was answer enough. The seal cracked. Paper unfolded. The partner read silently at first, then again, slower. Color left his face. Read it aloud, said the chief financial officer. He swallowed. To the board of Whitmore Holdings, if this letter is opened, it means my son has attempted a transfer of control without honoring the obligations attached to inheritance. No one moved. Richard stared at the window, not the paper. The partner continued. Control of Whitmore Holdings was divided years ago into two structures. 49% remained with my family line. 51% was transferred into a labor trust to protect pensions, wages, and employee housing initiatives from future liquidation. A board member whispered, 51. Another sank slowly into a chair near the wall. Naomi felt the room tilt around a center that was no longer Richard Whitmore. The trust, the partner continued, shall remain unnamed until activated by an attempted sale contrary to these terms. Upon activation, the acting steward shall be the designated heir of Grace Brooks. Every head turned toward Naomi. Richard finally looked at her fully, as if seeing her for the first time and hating that fact at once. That is impossible, he said. Grace was staff. The chief financial officer answered before anyone else could. Staff built this company too. The words surprised even her. The partner opened the leather ledger with shaking fingers. Inside were signatures, filings, transfer stamps, and notarized records spanning years. Eleanor Whitmore had prepared everything with the precision of someone who knew exactly what kind of man her son might become. Richard stepped forward. Forgery. Then challenge your mother in court, said the partner quietly. These documents are authentic. Naomi looked down at the steel box still resting in the drawer. Her fingers lifted the lid. Inside lay one final item, a handwritten note folded once. Her name was on the front in careful blue ink. Naomi. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The room waited. Grace Brooks' handwriting, smaller than she remembered, moved across the page. If you are reading this, then they finally forgot that dignity has owners too. Do not punish them with anger. Correct them with truth. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second. When she opened them, Richard Whitmore was no longer standing like a king at the head of a table. He was just a man in an expensive suit, watching the company leave his hands. No one spoke for several seconds after the last page was verified. The office seemed to absorb sound the way old wood absorbs rain. Beyond the windows, barges moved slowly across the river, horns distant and muted, while inside Whitmore Tower a different kind of current had shifted forever. Naomi Brooks still held her mother's note. Richard Whitmore stood beside the desk with both hands at his sides, fingers curled slightly, as though gripping control that was no longer there. The chief financial officer was the first to recover. We need to return to the boardroom immediately, she said. The transaction must be suspended. The law partner nodded. Not suspended. Invalid under the trust structure unless approved by the acting steward. His eyes moved to Naomi with cautious respect. She was no longer background to anyone in the room. Richard let out a short breath through his nose. This is absurd. She cleans hallways. Today, the chief financial officer replied. Apparently, she also controls 51% of the company. Richard turned toward Naomi. You planned this. No, Naomi said softly. My mother planned for you. That sentence struck harder than raised voices ever could. He looked away first. They walked back through the corridor together, but the order had changed. Naomi was no longer trailing a service cart behind executives. She walked in front beside the law partner, the brass key still in her hand. Employees paused at corners and near elevators, sensing something important had happened though no one yet knew what. Rumors moved faster than elevators in towers like this. By the time the boardroom doors opened again, phones were already buzzing across 3 floors. The same room that had laughed at Naomi less than an hour earlier now waited in careful silence. Chairs were still warm. Water glasses still half full. Richard's signature sat unfinished on page 12 of the contract. Sunlight had shifted, casting long gold bars across the table. Naomi noticed the chair at the head of the room remained empty. Richard noticed it too. Please be seated, said the chief financial officer. This time no one looked to Richard for permission. Naomi moved toward the side wall by instinct, toward the place invisible people were expected to stand. The law partner stopped her gently. Miss Brooks, he said, voice clear enough for all to hear. You should sit at the table. Several eyes dropped in embarrassment. Naomi hesitated only a second, then took an open seat halfway down the right side. Leather side beneath her as she sat. Richard remained standing. The board members avoided meeting his gaze. The chief financial officer opened the verified documents. For the record, Eleanor Whitmore established the Workers' Preservation Trust 11 years ago. Trigger conditions have been met. Acting stewardship transferred upon attempted. Unauthorized sale. She looked directly at Naomi. Effective this morning. A younger board member who had laughed earlier now cleared his throat. Miss Brooks, I would like to apologize for my conduct. Another followed. Then another. Their voices were polished, practiced, careful. Naomi listened without expression. Apologies sounded different when comfort was no longer guaranteed. Richard finally pulled out the chair at the head of the table, but did not sit. This company was built by my father, he said. Expanded by me. You cannot hand it to someone with no executive experience because of sentimental politics. Naomi turned toward him calmly. No one handed it to me. Your mother trusted me through my mother. There is a difference. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The law partner slid the unfinished contract away from Richard and replaced it with a blank yellow legal pad. Symbolism was not subtle in rooms like this. We need direction from the acting steward, he said. Every face turned to Naomi again. She felt the weight of expensive expectation pressing from all sides. For years she had entered rooms like this only to wipe them clean after other people made decisions. Now the room itself seemed to wait for her voice. She unfolded Grace Brooks' note once more under the table and reread the final line. Correct them with truth. Naomi set the note beside her water glass and lifted her chin. First, she said, no one loses their pension. Several staff representatives on video screens exhaled visibly. Second, no employee housing program gets sold for short-term profit. More heads nodded. Third, every contractor on night shift receives the same health coverage offered to daytime staff. The chief financial officer began writing fast. Naomi continued. Fourth, Eleanor Whitmore's office remains open as an employee resource center, not a shrine. A murmur moved through the room. Richard laughed once, bitter and low. You are turning a corporation into charity. Naomi met his eyes. No, I am turning inheritance into responsibility. The room fell still again. Some people looked at her with admiration, others with calculation, a few with shame. But all of them listened. Richard slowly sat down at last, not in the head chair, but in the seat nearest the end. No one commented on it. No one needed to. Power often announces itself loudly when arriving and quietly when leaving. The chief financial officer placed a final sheet in front of Naomi. Temporary authority acknowledgement, she said. If you sign, the sale is officially canceled pending full restructuring. Naomi looked at the pen beside the paper. It was the same expensive pen Richard had nearly used earlier. She picked it up, felt its surprising weight, and signed her name in steady blue ink. Naomi Grace Brooks. The law partner nodded. It is done. Outside the glass walls, late sunlight broke through clouds and lit the city in copper and gold. Inside, Richard Whitmore stared at the signature for a long moment before speaking. What do you want from me? Naomi capped the pen and set it down gently. For the first time, she said, I want you to earn your seat. The meeting should have ended there, with signatures reversed and pride reduced to silence. But power rarely leaves a room without trying one last time to stay. Twilight had begun to soften the skyline beyond the glass walls, turning towers into dark blue shapes edged with fire. Inside the boardroom, assistants moved carefully, collecting obsolete contracts and replacing them with new folders marked interim governance. Phones buzzed nonstop. Legal teams called in from Chicago, Dallas, and Boston. Markets would open to the news in the morning. Naomi Brooks remained seated, reading each page slowly, refusing to be rushed by people who had built careers on rushing others. Richard Whitmore watched from the end of the table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Then he stood. Every sound in the room thinned. I would like a private word, he said. Naomi looked up. You have had many private words in this building, Mr. Whitmore. They are usually expensive. A few eyes dropped to hide smiles. Richard did not react. 5 minutes. The chief financial officer began to object, but Naomi raised a hand slightly. It is fine. One by one, the others stepped out into the hallway, carrying laptops and tension with them. The glass doors closed softly. For the first time all day, only 2 people remained in the room that had separated them by class for years and by truth for only hours. Richard walked to the window, looking down at the city instead of at her. Do you know what people will say tomorrow? He asked. That I was humiliated by a housekeeper. Naomi stacked the papers neatly. No, they will say you were corrected by someone you ignored. He let out a dry laugh. You speak like my mother. Then perhaps you should listen. He turned then, older somehow than he had that morning. Without an audience, the polish on him seemed thinner. You think this is simple morality. Cruel son, noble worker, hidden documents, justice served. I think it is exactly what happened. He shook his head. My father left debt. Lawsuits. Unions threatening strikes. Banks ready to carve this company apart. I was 26. Your mother cleaned floors. Mine signed rescue notes at midnight. I learned early that softness costs money. Naomi listened. She had waited years to hear a man like him explain himself without applause nearby. And what did hardness cost? She asked. He said nothing for several seconds. Outside, a helicopter crossed the river with a slow red blink. Everything useful, he answered quietly. Naomi did not expect honesty to sound so tired. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box. He set it on the table between them. My mother intended to give you this when Grace retired. Naomi did not touch it. How would you know what she intended? Because she told me. And I ignored her, too. He opened the box. Inside lay a gold service pin shaped like a rising sun, engraved with the words built by hands unseen. Naomi felt her throat tighten before she could stop it. She had seen that pin once on Eleanor Whitmore's desk years ago while dusting nearby with her mother. Grace had smiled at it, but never explained why. She created it for employees who carried the company when executives took credit, Richard said. She said Grace Brooks was the first person who deserved it. Naomi looked down at the small pin shining under boardroom lights. Then why was it never given? Richard's jaw shifted. Because I told her recognition of staff would look weak during restructuring. He did not hide from the shame in that sentence. 2 weeks later, she became ill. Silence entered again, but this time it did not accuse. It mourned. Naomi closed the box gently. My mother waited 30 years for respect, she said. A pin would not have been enough. I know. He took a breath that seemed difficult. I cannot change what I was. No, Naomi said. But you can stop charging interest on it. He almost smiled, then failed. There was a knock at the glass door. The chief financial officer stood outside with fresh documents. Naomi signaled 1 minute. Richard remained where he was. They will follow you now, he said. For a while. They never followed me, Naomi replied. They followed consequences. He nodded once. Then let me offer one thing that is not strategy. He straightened, not as a chairman, not as an heir, but as a man speaking without armor. I am sorry for what I said to you this morning. I am sorry for what I allowed people like me to say to people like your mother for years. Naomi searched his face. Apologies from powerful people often arrived polished and empty. This one arrived late and bruised. My mother would have accepted that faster than I will, she said. She was kinder. And you? He asked. Naomi slid the velvet box back toward him. I am fair. She stood and walked to the head chair, now hers only because paper said so. Stay on the board, she added. Richard looked genuinely surprised. After today? Especially after today. Someone needs to remember what arrogance looks like from the inside. A sound escaped him then, half laugh, half surrender. The chief financial officer entered with the others. New packets were distributed. Cameras were scheduled for the morning statement. Lawyers resumed speaking in fast, careful tones. Naomi pinned the gold sun to the inside of her blazer pocket, over her heart where no one could see it yet. Richard took his new seat halfway down the table without complaint. As the first restructuring vote began, a janitor in the hallway outside paused to glance through the glass and frowned in confusion. The woman who used to pour coffee was leading the room, and the billionaire was taking notes. By the time the final vote ended, night had fully taken the city. The boardroom windows had become mirrors, reflecting rows of tired faces and the thin white lines of ceiling lights above them. Midtown glittered beyond the glass like another universe, one made of taxis, rooftop bars, and people who had no idea an empire had quietly changed hands 42 floors up. The lawyers packed their briefcases with the stunned care of men who knew they would be retelling this day for years. Executives spoke in hushed voices, suddenly polite to assistants they had overlooked that morning. One by one, they drifted out until only the hum of climate control remained. Naomi Brooks stayed behind at the long table, shoulders finally heavy now that no one was watching. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was fading, leaving a deeper ache underneath. She removed her badge and set it beside the empty water glass. The small rectangle of plastic caught the light. Naomi Brooks, Facilities Services. She traced the letters once with her thumb. For years that badge had opened service elevators, storage closets, and doors meant for people who entered rooms only after decisions were made. Tonight it sat beside documents naming her acting steward of Whitmore Holdings. Strange how paper could change everything while changing nothing at all. The glass door opened softly. Richard Whitmore stepped in carrying 2 paper cups from the vending station downstairs. No silver tray now. No assistant. No ceremony. Coffee, he said. Terrible coffee, but honest coffee. Naomi almost smiled despite herself. He placed 1 cup near her and took a seat several chairs away, careful not to assume closeness that had not been earned. Steam rose between them in thin white threads. For a moment neither spoke. The city outside pulsed in silence. My mother used to sit here after meetings, Richard said at last, staring toward the head chair. She would turn off half the lights and wait until everyone left before deciding what she really thought. Naomi lifted the cup. It was too hot and too bitter. My mother used to clean here after meetings, she replied. She said rich people spilled more than coffee. Richard let out a low laugh, genuine and surprised by itself. That sounds like Grace. Naomi looked at him. You remember her more than I thought. He nodded slowly. She once told me at age 14 that talent without manners becomes expensive. And did you listen? Not enough. Silence settled again, softer this time. It no longer felt like a battlefield pause. It felt like 2 people standing in the same weather after years of living under different roofs. Naomi leaned back and looked around the room. Chairs pushed in neatly. Contracts boxed away. Reflections floating on dark windows. I used to imagine this place, she said. When I was helping my mother on summer nights, I would look through the glass and think people in here must know exactly who they are. Richard turned the paper cup slowly between his palms. Most people in here were terrified someone would find out they did not. That honesty landed without defense. Naomi believed him. Power often looked like certainty from far away and panic from up close. She reached into her blazer pocket and removed the gold pin Richard had shown her earlier. Built by hands unseen. She rolled it gently in her fingers. My mother never told me about this. She knew you would not need symbols, Richard said. She was right. Naomi placed the pin on the table between them. She also knew I would need proof. Richard's gaze lowered. She knew many things. The room cooled slightly as the air system shifted. Somewhere in the hallway a janitor's cart rattled past, wheels clicking over tile. Naomi listened until the sound faded. It reminded her that night crews were beginning their shifts right now, emptying bins, wiping glass, vacuuming offices where tomorrow's headlines would be discussed. She wondered how many had mothers like Grace. How many children had learned to stay quiet because rent was due. Tomorrow, Richard said carefully, the press will ask who you are. Naomi answered without hesitation. Then they should ask who everyone else ignored. He accepted that with a nod. And if they ask what happens to me? Naomi took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. Tell the truth for once. Say you are learning. He stared out at the skyline, where red aircraft lights blinked above black rooftops. Do people really change? He asked. It was the first question he had asked all day that sounded unguarded. Naomi thought of Grace Brooks polishing rooms she would never own, still greeting people kindly who barely saw her. She thought of Eleanor Whitmore building a trust in secret because she knew decency sometimes needed legal armor. She thought of herself this morning, carrying coffee into a room that expected silence. Sometimes, Naomi said, but not because they are shamed, because they are finally honest enough to be uncomfortable. Richard absorbed that slowly. He rose to leave, then paused. For what it is worth, my mother would have liked this version of you in that chair. Naomi looked toward the head seat glowing faintly under recessed lights. She liked my mother first, she said. That is why I am here. Richard placed a hand on the back of a chair, then let it go. Good night, Miss Brooks. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. He walked out quietly, closing the door behind him. Naomi remained alone with the skyline and the hum of the tower. She picked up her old facilities badge in one hand and the gold pin in the other. One opened closets. One recognized labor. She set them side by side on the polished table and watched their reflections merge in the dark glass. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, slowly, fully. The room that once made her feel small now felt exactly its true size. The next morning, Whitmore Tower woke up before sunrise. News vans lined the curb with satellite dishes pointed at the sky like metal flowers. Camera crews adjusted tripods under the awning. Reporters in wool coats rehearsed live openings while steam rose from street grates into the cold Manhattan air. Employees entering the lobby slowed when they saw microphones and security barriers. Some looked nervous. Some looked thrilled. Some looked like they had been waiting years for a day when the building belonged to a different story. On the 42nd floor, Naomi Brooks stood alone in a quiet conference room smaller than the boardroom, but warmer somehow. A tray held fruit no one would touch, pastries arranged too perfectly, and coffee from a machine far better than the vending cup from the night before. She wore a navy blazer borrowed from corporate wardrobe services, tailored quickly at dawn, with simple pearl earrings that had belonged to Grace Brooks. Her old facilities badge rested in her purse. The gold pin remained hidden inside her lapel. Through the glass wall, she could see assistants moving briskly, setting up podium lights and checking audio feeds. Every few minutes, someone asked if she needed anything. The same building that once trained itself not to see her had become almost desperate to anticipate her comfort. It was not kindness, Naomi knew. It was adjustment. Still, even adjustment can become the first step toward decency. There was a knock. Richard Whitmore entered carrying a folder and no entourage. He wore a dark blue suit with no tie. For the first time she had ever seen him, he looked like a man dressed himself rather than being assembled by staff. "The press room is full," he said. "Some are calling this a corporate coup." Naomi accepted the folder. That usually means wealthy people are surprised. Richard almost smiled. "There is one more matter." He handed her a single page from archives. It was an old payroll ledger. Grace Brooks' name appeared near the bottom. Years ago, hourly rates circled in red. Beside it, in Eleanor Whitmore's handwriting, were 3 words: "Raise approved immediately." Naomi touched the faded ink with one finger. "She fought for her," Richard said quietly. "Often." Naomi closed the folder. Then she understood who made her rich. He nodded. "More than I did." They walked together toward the press room. Employees along the corridor stopped speaking when they passed. Some offered small smiles to Naomi. Others looked ashamed to remember how often they had looked through her. At the double doors, the chief financial officer adjusted Naomi's microphone. 2 minutes, she said. "Markets open in 20. Naomi could hear the muffled hum of reporters. Beyond the wall, the restless murmur of people who sensed drama and wanted names. Her pulse quickened at last. Not from fear of cameras. From fear of becoming a symbol people applauded while ignoring the people still cleaning floors downstairs. Richard noticed her hands still. "You can let me handle the opening statement," he said. "They expect me." Naomi looked straight ahead. "That is exactly why I should speak." The doors opened. Light flooded in from television rigs and camera panels. Rows of reporters turned at once. The room brightened with flashes. Naomi walked to the podium at center stage. Richard took a seat off to the side, not in front. The room noticed that immediately. Microphones waited beneath the Whitmore Holdings logo. Naomi set her notes down, then moved them aside untouched. The room quieted. "Good morning," she began. Her voice carried clear and steady. "Yesterday, I entered this building through the service elevator, as I have many times. Today, I came through the front doors. Both entrances lead to the same floor. That matters more than it should." Pens began moving. Cameras leaned in. There are many stories being told this morning about power, inheritance, and surprise. But the real story is simpler. For years, people who kept this company running were treated like background. Night crews, reception staff, cafeteria workers, security teams, maintenance workers. People whose names were rarely known by those who depended on them every day. Several employees standing along the back wall lowered their eyes. Naomi continued. "My mother, Grace Brooks, worked in this building nearly 3 decades. She taught me that dignity does not need a title, but titles often need dignity." A soft murmur moved through the room. Richard looked down, then back up. "Whitmore Holdings will remain profitable," Naomi said, "but it will also remain human. Effective immediately, employee housing protections stay in place. Pension obligations remain funded. Night shift health coverage expands this quarter. And executive bonuses will now be tied to retention and wage growth, not only stock performance." That line hit the room like a dropped tray. Hands shot up. Questions erupted. Naomi lifted one hand, and the room settled again. You may ask if I am qualified. That is fair. I ask something in return. Why were so many qualified people ignored simply because they wore the wrong uniform? Silence answered before reporters did. Naomi let it stand. Then she stepped away from the podium unexpectedly. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Head snapped toward him. Richard rose slowly and joined her at center stage. Naomi removed the hidden gold pin from inside her lapel and held it up so cameras could see the engraved words built by hands unseen. This was meant for my mother, she said. She never received it. She pinned it to Richard's jacket. Gasps flickered through the room. Richard looked stunned. Naomi's voice remained calm. Earn it. No one moved. Richard swallowed once, then faced the microphones. I intend to, he said quietly. It was the shortest statement he had ever made, and perhaps the first one people believed. Across the back wall, janitors in gray uniforms watched from the doorway. One older woman pressed a hand to her mouth. Another began to cry softly. Naomi saw them, and only them, when the cameras started flashing again. The clip of Naomi pinning the gold emblem to Richard Whitmore's jacket traveled across the country before noon. By 1 o'clock, cable networks were replaying it beside market graphics and headlines about a corporate reckoning. By 3, office workers in Chicago, nurses in Atlanta, mechanics in Detroit, and teachers in Phoenix had watched a former billionaire chairman stand still while a woman once treated as invisible told him to earn respect. But inside Whitmore Tower, fame felt smaller than paperwork. Naomi Brooks spent the afternoon in conference rooms reviewing benefit schedules, pension liabilities, and maintenance contracts that had been quietly outsourced to shell vendors charging triple rates. Every page told the same story in different fonts. Money moved upward while gratitude moved nowhere. She signed temporary freezes, requested audits, and asked for names rather than departments. Whenever executives answered with numbers only, she asked again, who does this affect? By the 5th repetition, people began arriving with names. Near 6 o'clock, the building emptied into evening. Elevators thinned. Hallways softened. The city outside glowed amber through winter haze. Naomi left the executive floor carrying her shoes in one hand and a stack of folders in the other. She had changed back into sensible flats because power did not make heels less painful. Instead of taking the private elevator now assigned to her, she stepped into the old service lift at the end of the corridor. The metal doors closed with the same stubborn rattle she remembered from years of night shifts. Floor numbers blinked downward one by one. On 23, the elevator stopped. Richard Whitmore entered alone, carrying a cardboard box filled with framed photos, desk items, and a plant leaning sideways in dry soil. He looked at Naomi, then at the service lift, then almost laughed. Apparently this one still works, he said. Naomi moved the folders to make room. It always worked. Some people just never wrote it. He set the box down carefully between them. For a few floors, only the hum of cables spoke. Naomi glanced into the box. Family photos. A crystal paperweight. Eleanor Whitmore's fountain pen. The gold pin still rested on his jacket. Cleaning out your office? She asked. Moving out of it, he said. I asked facilities to convert it into interview space for employee assistance counselors. Naomi looked at him sideways. That was approved 10 minutes ago. I know. I was trying to impress management. The elevator doors opened on 17. No one entered. They closed again. Richard's expression grew serious. I found something else in my mother's files. He reached into the box and handed Naomi a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in Eleanor Whitmore's careful script. Naomi's breath caught. Why did you not open it? Because for once, I understood it was not mine. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single handwritten page. Naomi, if this reaches you, then time did what titles could not. Grace once told me that good people are often kept waiting by people with keys. I am sorry for every door I opened too late. If you ever lead here, remember this building is strongest at night, when those with no spotlight keep everything standing. Protect them first. Naomi read the letter twice. The elevator seemed suddenly very quiet. She knew, Naomi whispered. She hoped. Richard corrected gently. There is a difference. The doors opened at lobby level. Evening crowds moved through marble corridors with shopping bags and winter coats. Security guards straightened when they saw Naomi, then relaxed when she smiled first. Richard picked up his box. There is one more thing, he said. He led her across the lobby toward a side hallway few executives ever used. At the end was a plain break room with fluorescent lights, vending machines, and a coffee maker older than most interns. Inside, nearly 40 employees waited: janitors, receptionists, security officers, dishwashers, male clerks, electricians, and maintenance staff in uniforms of every color and fabric. Some still wore gloves. Some held paper plates with sheet cake. A handmade sign hung crookedly on the wall. "Congratulations, Naomi." Naomi stopped in the doorway, stunned. Mrs. Delgado from night sanitation stepped forward first, flowers still on her sleeve from the cafeteria. "We know rich people will do a fancy party upstairs," she said. "So we made the real one down here." Laughter broke the room open. Someone handed Naomi a plastic fork. Someone else pressed a slice of cake into her hand before she could protest. Richard remained near the door, uncertain whether to stay. Mrs. Delgado noticed him immediately. "You too," she said, pointing at an empty folding chair. "Sit down if you are going to learn manners." The room laughed harder. Richard, to everyone's surprise including his own, obeyed. Naomi looked around at faces tired from work and bright with pride. Men and women who had kept elevators running, floors shining, pipes warm, meals served, mail delivered. Hands unseen. She set Eleanor's letter beside the cake and raised her paper cup of vending machine punch. "To my mother," she said. Cups lifted everywhere. "To Grace," they answered. Naomi looked at Richard, then at the room. "And to every person who was told they were background." "Not anymore," said a security guard from the back. The cheer that followed shook the cheap ceiling tiles. Richard clapped too, slowly at first, then fully. Naomi noticed tears standing in the eyes of two older housekeepers who had worked beside Grace for years. She crossed the room and hugged them both. No cameras were there. No reporters. No stock analysts. Just fluorescent light, grocery store frosting, tired shoes, and something rarer than headlines. A place finally telling the truth about who held it up. 3 months later, the first thing people noticed about Whitmore Tower was the light. Not the expensive chandeliers in the lobby or the skyline glittering off the upper floors, but the simple lights that stayed on in places once forgotten. The employee clinic on level 6 opened at 6 in the morning for night crews ending shifts. The counseling center in Eleanor Whitmore's former office kept warm lamps glowing past sunset. Break rooms had fresh paint, real chairs, and coffee that no longer tasted like punishment. Small changes, some would call them. But people who had spent years being overlooked knew that dignity often arrives disguised as ordinary things. On a bright spring morning, Naomi Brooks entered through the front doors carrying her own bag and wearing the same steady expression she had worn while pushing service carts. Security greeted her by name. Receptionists did not stand because she had asked them not to. In the lobby, a bronze plaque had quietly replaced an old donor wall. It read, "This building stands because someone showed up before dawn." Naomi paused each time she passed it, not out of vanity, but gratitude. She had insisted no individual names be listed. Too many hands had earned the space. Markets had stabilized. Investors who threatened to flee had stayed once profits held. Executive bonuses now depended on retention, training, and wage growth. Complaints about the new culture had become applications from companies wanting to copy it. Journalists still asked for interviews. Naomi gave few. She had learned cameras loved transformation stories, but grew bored of maintenance. Yet maintenance was where justice lived after headlines left. In the boardroom, the long walnut table remained, but the seating chart no longer centered around one chair. Every meeting began with department reports from staff leaders rotating monthly. Custodial, security, food services, maintenance, then finance. Then strategy. Some executives hated it at first. Most adapted. A few resigned. Their replacements listened better. Richard Whitmore now arrived early and usually carried his own coffee. He chaired no meetings, but he attended nearly all of them. The gold pin still rested on his jacket most days, though worn now at the edges from use. He spoke less than before and apologized faster. No miracle had turned him into a saint. He still preferred control, still disliked inefficiency, still tightened his jaw when challenged. But when a junior analyst dismissed a janitor's complaint about air quality one morning, Richard was the one who said, "If you cannot respect the source, at least respect the information." The room had gone silent for an entirely different reason than it once had. Naomi heard about it later and said nothing. Change does not need applause every time it blinks. That afternoon, she took the service elevator to the basement storage level. She still used it often. Some habits were roots, not scars. In a quiet records room newly organized and clean, she opened a small locker labeled Brooks, Grace. Inside sat her mother's old gloves, a folded cleaning apron, and a photograph of Grace laughing beside two coworkers during a holiday shift years ago. Naomi touched the picture gently. "You were right," she whispered. "They did forget who built it. And then they remembered." She placed Eleanor's letter beside the photograph and closed the locker softly. When she returned upstairs, the building buzzed with normal life. Deliveries rolled through side doors. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Someone laughed too loudly near legal. Ordinary sounds. Honest sounds. At 5:30, Naomi stood by the boardroom windows watching the city turn gold. Richard entered carrying 2 cups. "Still terrible coffee," he said. "Consistently terrible." She accepted one. Consistency matters. They stood several feet apart, looking over the river. Ferries moved like white stitches across dark water. "There is something I have never asked," Richard said. "Why did you not remove me completely when you could have?" Naomi considered the skyline before answering. "Because punishment teaches fear. Responsibility teaches memory." He absorbed that slowly. "And if I fail?" She looked at him then. "Then this time, everyone will notice." He nodded once, oddly comforted by the honesty. Down in the lobby, evening staff began arriving with lunch bags, jackets, tired feet, and conversations about rent, children, traffic, and weather. People who would keep the tower alive through the night. Naomi watched them on the security monitor mounted near the wall. "Meeting starts in 10, Richard said. "I know." She did not move. Neither did he. Below them, a janitor paused near the entrance to help an elderly visitor with a dropped scarf. The woman smiled. He smiled back. Then both continued on their separate ways. Small kindness. Unrecorded.